Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here. You should want to hear the information that I'm going to offer you this morning in any event, but especially you want to hear this information because, no kidding, I will have information that could win for you $100,000. This is not a joke. You're going to get the details later in the talk by Joe McKinney and Joe Quirk. They're going to do a panel later, and they're going to give you details that will let you know again how you could make $100,000 off of some of the information I'm going to offer you here today. So I want to talk about special economic zones in Puerto Rico, and it's going to cover a number of things: global and national trends in special economic zones. For many of you, this is old news, worth repeating, but nonetheless, for some of you, it'll be new news. We'll talk about Puerto Rico's special disadvantages. I'm not an expert on Puerto Rico, but preparing for this talk and hanging around with people like you has gotten me interested in Puerto Rico. I'll share some of my observations. And then I'll offer this approach to the problems of Puerto Rico using special economic zones that offers, I think, a third way between statehood and its continuing sort of not working dependency on the United States. Special economic zones offer a third way that I think might work for Puerto Rico. Let's start out with these global and national trends. These mostly come from my book, Your Next Government, which is available at fine outlets everywhere. It's got a ton of information about special economic zones and special jurisdictions generally. And that's where these charts come from. Let's start out with just looking at these global trends. This first one is the number of special economic zones and similar zones like free ports, export processing zones, free trade zones worldwide. And the short of it is, wow, they're booming. It depends on how you count them, but on some counts there's over 10,000 of these now. Easily there's over 4,000 worldwide. And a little thing I want you to note here, it's not quite fair to Puerto Rico. I'm going to fix this in a minute. But you'll notice this starts here at 1958. And I'll explain in a minute how arguably Puerto Rico got there before everybody else, and that date should be pushed back. But more about that in a second. Here's another very simple graph, which does a line going up. This is the percentage of countries with SEZs or similar zones, and it's getting closer and closer to 100. Almost every country in the world already has some of these, sometimes many of these zones. You might wonder, I mean, people who want to cast shade on this say, well, the curve is flattening out a little bit. Well, of course, if you look at any environment and you study the spread of some new life being through it, some new species on a volcanic island, for example, it takes an S-shaped curve. Is exactly what's going on here. To a biologist, if you think of special zones as kind of this new political animal, which they are, this is exactly what you'd expect to see. And it's true in the United States. The United States has had special economic zones of a sort since, well, by this accounting, 1934. And the zones that the United States has are called foreign trade zones, FTZs, and Puerto Rico has some of these too. I could say more about these FTZs, but I'll save that for when we get to Puerto Rico. The observation is simply that, hey, you know, America's with the rest of the world. You might not have known this. The reason I like to share this information is I didn't know it either until I wrote my book. I started writing my book, had to do research, and my jaw dropped. I didn't know these things existed. There's about 200 of these up and running. These are the, it's not showing on this. There's one of the colors is not showing, but the net approved zones line would be in this 200 range. In fact, they're all over the place. I'm sure you would not have to drive far from here to find a U.S. foreign trade zone. So this is just to let you know, wow, this is nothing new really. It turns out these special jurisdictions are everywhere in the world. They're very popular, even in the United States. Why? This is a picture of Korea, North and South Korea at night. It's a great photo. You might have seen this before, but it bears repeating because it shows that government matters. It matters so much. Libertarians and Friends of Liberty might rag on governments, and to be sure, they can do terrible things. I don't know that we can credit the South Korean government for all the bright lights there, but I think we can certainly blame the North Korean government for the blank spot on the map. That is where North Koreans live in the dark, literally and figuratively. Literally because they don't have electricity, and it doesn't show up at night in this satellite photo. It's very clear. You cross over the line, you're back in the dark ages. And figuratively, of course, because the poor people in North Korea are imprisoned by a totalitarian dictator, and they don't have news of the world, they don't have freedom, it's terrible. Government really matters. At least when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. And this has been noticed, most notably in China. So this is a quick look at Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong was not created as a special economic zone, right? It was created because the English had a fight with the Chinese and they wanted a chunk of Chinese land, and so they took it because they could. China in that era suffered a lot of taking by foreign governments in that manner. And the British did especially well with Hong Kong. It boomed. So it didn't start as a kind of model legal system, but it turned out like that because Hong Kong thrived while the rest of China, well, I was going to say languished, which is fair, but I think I could say went to ruin. Hong Kong was booming, had among the highest per capita incomes in the world, while across the straits in mainland China under Mao, tens of millions of Chinese were starving under government policies like the so-called Great Leap Forward. They were eating grass, they were eating each other by some accounts. And they could walk up to the fence and look over and say, wow, look at Hong Kong. They're rich there, and what's going on? It's just like North-South Korea. Same culture, same people, same climate, same geography. You look over the fence in Hong Kong if you're starving in Maoist China, and you say, that's us, that's China. But they're rich and fat and happy, and we're dying of starvation. What's up? Governance. You get governance wrong, people suffer. Hong Kong shows how great it can be. Over 34 years, a father-son team took these photos from Mount Victoria in Hong Kong. Boom, you see the growth here. And the Chinese, despite their foibles in government, were not fools. Under Xi Jinping, they looked across the straits, they said, wow, we want some of that in China. And this shows the spread of SEZs across China. It stops at 2006. This particular source only makes it that far. I've updated the records. I've done the math on this. The funny thing is, in China, the so-called special economic zones are in the majority. I wanted to put this in my book, but it turned out I'd have to have like 2 pages of notes just to kind of prove I'd done the research. Take my word for it. There's just a minuscule number of Chinese now. There's a few little territories tucked way up in the corners of China, out in the hinterlands, which are kind of under still the run-of-the-mill vanilla Chinese governance. Every place else in China has been converted to some kind of special zone. They typically have layers of zones upon zones. You have a regional zone, and then there's a special zone in a city, and then they might have another special zone in a port. It's really amazing. And it's taken off because the Chinese are not fools and they don't like starving. The difficult part for them was making that transition, to getting them to recognize, oh, well, maybe, we won't say we're capitalists, but maybe we could have something that kind of looks like property rights. Maybe we should do that. Oh, communism is awesome. Nothing against Marx, but, you know, so we can have a little less, you know, starving. And that's what they did. They started first in Shenzhen, which if you go back, you can see Shenzhen is right across the border. There's Shenzhen. Right there, right across the border from Hong Kong. So it was a natural place to start this experiment in governance. And at first it was very tentative and quiet and careful. Boom, it worked. And then it spread as the other map I showed you demonstrates. So that's Shenzhen over 25 years. Remember Hong Kong, 34 years, lots of growth. Shenzhen, 25 years, lots of growth too. And it didn't stop there. So China had this huge success with special zones. It's really one of the great success stories of the late 20th century. I think we can credit the principles of freedom for saving tens of thousands of people from tens of millions of people from starvation in China. It's now a comfortably lower middle class country. That is wonderful. So, yay markets, yay property rights. In Dubai, they learned this lesson. So in Dubai too, they set aside this special area, the Dubai International Financial Center, where they said in this area different rules apply. It wasn't property rights here that they needed, but rather the ability to charge interest on loans and other financial regulations that, surprise, surprise, people in the finance industry need. So in Dubai, before they instituted this international financial zone, under Sharia law, they couldn't charge interest on loans. Well, international financiers don't like that. So they said, in this small area, we're going to let you charge interest on loans, and we have other reforms to make it easier to do business. Over 13 years, Dubai exploded. And this is from 2003. I'm sure you'd see even more growth if you were to visit today. Now, before I move on, so these are great examples about how, wow, countries that have implemented these zones have thrived, They're very popular all over the world. And you might naturally jump to the conclusion, this is where I started too, well, we should do this in Puerto Rico, and this will be Puerto Rico over 10 years. But let's slow down a little bit and note that when you go from a system where there's no property rights to just recognizing property rights, that's an easy big win. I'm not pretending it's easy to make that reform, but it's like low-hanging fruit. You look around the governance system, you go, wow, you people are starving. Let's diagnose this problem. Oh, you don't have property rights. Let's fix that. And you fix that and people do better. And in Dubai, well, there's not a lot going on here. It's a bunch of sand and camels. What's up? And you diagnose it. Oh, you can't charge interest on loans. Well, maybe you should fix that. So that's easy to fix. But Puerto Rico's already got some pretty good rules on the books. So I honestly do not expect you to see this kind of growth in Puerto Rico. Let's just be honest about that. When you're already pretty close to the top, your marginal gains are going to be less. Just to give you a little cautionary note. Let's talk about how, though, Puerto Rico does suffer under some special disadvantages. It's not like the rest of the United States. So I worked up this chart. I don't know if you can see all this, but basically what I did was I took some things that people talk about in government that they care about, and I compared them to these different classes of areas of the United States. We have your standard United States state, like Virginia, the District of Columbia, called the Federal District, and then these unincorporated U.S. territories, America Samoa, these other places, and down at the bottom, beleaguered Puerto Rico. And what do we see? When you add up the sort of benefits of being in the United States, Puerto Rico, together with Guam, comes out at the bottom. Under this accounting, they take a hit on 4 counts. And the most notable one here, these are about, how much representation you get in the political process. And this deal with full representative, so Puerto Rico does get a representative in Congress, but he or she can only vote in committee and on procedural matters. So it's not full representation. And I think you can argue pretty plausibly that hurts them. What about the Jones Act? So the Jones Act is this U.S. law that says, if you visit a U.S. port and then you go to another U.S. port, you have to use a U.S.-built ship with U.S. mariners working on board. That applies to U.S. states, District of Columbia, not these other unincorporated U.S. territories, and then Guam and Puerto Rico. This is really hurting Puerto Rico. I've not been able to get hard numbers because it's a complicated issue, but let's just get the picture here. It's an island country, Puerto Rico, right? An island territory. So if you have a big Chinese cargo ship full of good stuff, MRIs and cars and whatever else you want, it can visit the Port of Los Angeles. That's okay. One visit's okay. Unload its stuff and sail off. And then that stuff gets throughout the United States using intermodal transport. They put it on rail cars. They maybe put it on a local ship, or more likely than not, they put it on a tractor-trailer truck. And that's okay with the Cabotage Act, with the Jones Act. In Puerto Rico, you can't do that. Well, you can't do that because, first of all, China's not going to send a big ship to Puerto Rico. There's not a big enough market. China's only going to send that big ship if it can also visit the United States. But whoops, you can't do that under the Jones Act. So Puerto Rico's effectively, thanks to U.S. law, cut off from the international markets. And that is killing them. It's killing them. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, what about federal taxes? It seems like Puerto Rico should be the richest place on earth. They don't have to pay federal taxes. So you could go back to this and say, oh yeah, that's very interesting, but they don't have to pay federal taxes. They're way ahead of everybody else. Not so. You look at this carefully, you realize, first of all, it only applies to bona fide residents. You don't just walk in there and say, hey, I'm in Puerto Rico, I don't have to pay taxes. You have to establish residency there. And if you work for the U.S. military or for the U.S. federal government, you're also not going to get this benefit. Worse yet, it only covers Puerto Rican personal income taxes. You see a lot of loose statements about, oh, you don't pay federal taxes in Puerto Rico. Wrong. You have to pay every federal tax, and there are a lot of them, except for personal income taxes if you're a permanent resident. Worse yet, other federal payroll taxes remain in force. So you still got to pay FICA, you still got to pay Social Security. And those are highly regressive. There's other problems with Puerto Rico too. The federal minimum wage laws apply in Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, that is a real killer. Why? Because minimum wage of $7 and I think it's 25 cents in Virginia is really a very low wage because the cost of living is so high. In Puerto Rico, it's 77% of sort of their mean income. So basically it's a middle class income is what, because the cost of living is so low in Puerto Rico, That's what minimum wage is in Puerto Rico. So effectively they've said to Puerto Rico, hey, yeah, you really can't hire anybody except managers. You know, if you hire somebody who's just like sweeping floors, you're going to have to pay them a manager's wages. So what do people do? They don't work, or they work off the books. This is a real mess for Puerto Rico. And what about U.S. regulations? Those remain in force. So I want to offer you this principle. Everyone talks about no representation, no taxation without representation. So you can say, oh, Puerto Rico, you know, they get kind of representation, so they get kind of taxation, but they don't get any slack cut on regulations. So I think we need to take this up as kind of a rallying call as well. Puerto Rico's subject to all this federal regulation, and they don't have anybody in Congress to stop it, to protect them. That's not fair to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico's in a bad spot. Let's talk about how zones can offer a third way. A third way between what are frankly just not workable alternatives. This is why I think Puerto Rico's a mess. Not an expert. From my look at it though, you either got statehood, which is not going to work for various reasons. I understand, I'm all about independence too, but it's just not going to work for Puerto Rico at this time. Or the current mess, which is a mess. Zones offer a third way. I'll give you an example here for the building code. So you might say, there's been a lot of talk about Puerto Rico, well, you know, they need to stiffen the building code. Maria really hurt them because, you know, they don't have a good building code. Wrong. They have the top of the line building code. What they've done in Puerto Rico, they said, we want the international best standards. That is our building code. So you think, well, I mean, if you build to this code, your building should stand 140 mile per hour winds. So what happened? Because there's one thing about having rules on the books, it's another thing to have them enforced. And so in Puerto Rico, they got these wonderful regulations. It's kind of like the minimum wage rule. Top of the line, good minimum wage. What's that do? Wrecks the economy. Top of the line building code. But they don't build to the code. Because why? Corruption and inefficiency. So a special zone could help here. You could set aside a special area of Puerto Rico where you say, here we're going to let you figure out how to protect yourself against hurricanes. I'd like to see them do what they do in France. In France, when you put up a new building, nobody from the French government comes around and looks around and makes sure the joists are well built. What they do is they say, have you got your certificate of insurance? Qu'est-ce que c'est? That is what you have to get in France. You get a private third party to come in and say, this building will stand up in an earthquake, or it's safe in a fire. If there's strong winds, it'll stand up. And the government just looks for that insurance certificate. It's another way to solve this problem, which doesn't rely on corrupt and inefficient government officials. We could do that in Puerto Rico in maybe a small zone. The beauty of special zones is it allows you to set aside a small area of a country or a territory like Puerto Rico and make a few changes there and see how it works. If it doesn't work, you say, well, it didn't work. If it does work, you can say, let's try that in other places. It makes it easier to enact reforms. Right now in Puerto Rico, they're trying hard. They're still working on the building code. They've allowed now for private parties to certify for compliance with the fire provisions, the fire prevention provisions of their building code. And that's a step forward. But the problem is, if you do reforms at the level of the whole territory, you got to convince everybody in Puerto Rico to get on board, and that's really difficult. If you have a small zone, it's easier. Well, let's talk about some specific ideas. By the way, here's Puerto Rico on dealing with building. This is the Ease of Doing Business Index, World Bank. Out of 190 so countries, Puerto Rico is 138. It's pretty much at the bottom. So it's great building code. It's a real bear to comply with it. It's just very inefficient. We could do better. And look, by the way, at the taxes. Oh, Puerto Rico doesn't have federal income taxes. I've already said why that's not so awesome. It still has income taxes. They're Puerto Rican. And it's very difficult to pay your taxes in Puerto Rico. We could do better. We could set up a special zone and try some experiments. So here's the part where, I can't say a whole lot about this now, but where if you listen carefully, $100,000 could be yours. Joe and Joe are going to tell you about this later. So here's a map of Puerto Rico. Look far out here on the east coast, this little bit here. This is where Roosevelt Roads is. It's a formal naval base that's been converted to private use. It's now managed by the Land Redevelopment Authority. And Roosevelt Roads is a very interesting place for what? For a sea zone, for a special seasetting zone is what I'm proposing at Roosevelt Roads. So we're now zooming in. This is a map of Roosevelt Roads, and it doesn't look too good on this screen, but if the color was right, you'd see there's a huge harbor here. They used to park 5 aircraft carriers at a time here. This is a huge area, and let's look at C5 here. This spot, so this is from a publication put out by the LRA, the Land Redevelopment Authority for Roosevelt Road, saying, hey, we have all this property, will you please come lease it out and develop it? So I looked at this document and I said, dang, this is a beautiful spot for a special seasteading zone. And if you could see here, I've actually picked out a couple of spots in the water. It's, you get your pick of depth. This shows the soundings. This is a former Coast Guard pier. This is all light industrial on the land. It's already zoned. There are buildings. There's a road there. There are utilities. Seasteaders, this place is waiting for you. And the LRA can't find anybody to lease this land. They've been through 2 marketers, and they have not been able to get anybody to take up their offers. And so maybe seasteaders could do something there. Last thing I want to talk about, so I'm taking you through 3 kinds of things we could do in Puerto Rico with special zones. First, hey, let's try just easing up on, say, minimum wage and some other regulations in some small areas. A little more radical, special seasteading zones at Roosevelt Roads. Even more radical, implementing ULEX. What is ULEX? ULEX is an open source, that by the way is a picture of a bush that is called ULEX. So it's named after a flower. And I had to come up with a cute little mascot, so that's the mascot for ULEX. And if you are into programming, you will recognize these fellows as the mascot for GNU and Linux. And these are open source computer operating systems. ULEX is an open source legal operating system, which means the rules are there for anyone to download, manipulate, and reuse. They're all from private, flag-free sources. So if you want to start a community which is purely private and have world-class rules, ULEX collects them all for you, organizes them, they're ready to plug and play. I've already put it on GitHub. And the rules come from private sources. This was mentioned in an earlier talk, I think it was Joe McKinney. So for example, there's the American Law Institute, private body in America which studies the law, and they publish the restatements of law. So you say, I want world-class common law-based contract law in my special jurisdiction. ULEX offers that to you by saying, for contract law, we're going to use the American Law Institute's restatement of the common law of contracts. So it's an organized, beautiful, polished version of contract law, which is ready for you to use. It's on the books. ULEX just kind of collects all these sources of law and puts them in a basket. And by the way, I want to give this show this picture to you of Joe McKinney. He went to the Dragon's Den competition at the European Resource Bank, and he won. He got 5,000 euros to help us make ULEX widely available, to help people implement it, to do things like put it on GitHub so we can do different versions and make it public. And so thank you, Joe. We're going to be putting that 5,000 euros to work, hopefully making Puerto Rico a better place. So to sum up, we've talked about, I think I'm out of time, we've talked about global and national trends for special jurisdictions. They're very popular for very good reason. We're not sure how much they could help Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico does suffer these special disadvantages, federal regulation, a lot of taxes, federal or not. We could do better. Maybe that is how we can help Puerto Rico. Statehood ain't going to happen, probably shouldn't happen. Independence isn't going to happen soon. Maybe that would be great for Puerto Rico. Right now their governing system doesn't seem too impressive, so maybe that wouldn't work too well. Special zones are a third way. It would give Puerto Ricans a chance to try some limited reforms. If they fail, you give them up. If they succeed, wow, you found a way out of this current mess. So with that, I'll stop and say thank you.